Good morning, Dan. Thank you so much for being with us here today at Unmukt, the Senior Hub.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And just a brief introduction so that anybody seeing us will know. So Daniel Lieberman is Professor of Human Evolutionary Biology and the Edward M. Lerner II Professor of Biological Sciences at Harvard University. He's based at the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, where he's director of the Skeletal Biology Laboratory. Professor Lieberman has authored over 100 peer-reviewed research and theoretical articles and is the author of 2 popular press books, The Evolution of the Human Head and The Story of the Human Body, Evolution, Health, and Disease, with a 3rd book, Exercise, scheduled for release next month. Professor Lieberman is an authority on the role of exercise in human evolution and more generally on how evolution has shaped human anatomy. He's also studying how evolution can yield insights for medicine and health. We are delighted to welcome you to Unmukt today, where you'll help us understand the relationship between evolution, health, aging, and exercise. Thank you once again, Dan, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and so we divide it up generally into 2 sections. We'll talk about, your subject, of course, general evolution and health. And in part 2, we will talk about aging, because that is something that many of the senior community that we work with here in India would be keen to know. Yeah, so much of your research has been carried out on indigenous hunter-gatherer societies who live in very different settings compared to urban industrialized humans. So can you explain how research on the former has sort of shed light on how we live today in the urban setting?
Well, today we live, as you say, half the world lives in cities. But until, 600 generations ago, everybody on the planet was a hunter-gatherer, and we were hunter-gatherers for millions of years. So we've changed our environments in literally a blink of an eye from an evolutionary perspective. So we still have, for the most part, the genes and bodies of hunter-gatherers, but we live in these very strange modern environments where we sit in chairs and we eat foods that are, grown and prepared and frozen and pure, blended and who knows what. We do all kinds of amazing things with our bodies. And we no longer have to be physically active in order to survive, many of us. So our world has changed, our environment has changed in many, many, many ways, but our bodies are still basically the same. And so if we really want to understand how and why the human body works the way it does, we can't just study, people who live in cities. And of course, most of the data comes from America and Europe and, Western cities as well, studying college students. We really need to look at the world as a whole, and that gives us enormous insight into how our bodies work and how to age better and how to prevent and fight disease.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, because it's so relevant, because as we are aging population and living longer and longer, lifestyle disease and NCDs is so much a part of our lives today.
That's correct. So one of the interesting things that we've learned is that it's true that people are living longer today than we used to, but actually long back in time, people also lived longer. It's that people got less healthy once farming was invented. So hunter-gatherers do have a reasonably high childhood mortality rate. But if they survive childhood, they're likely to live about 7 decades. They live long and pretty healthy lives. And it was with the origins of farming, when people started living in villages and cities, cheek by jowl with animals, with poor sanitation and large groups of people where we can transmit diseases, for example, that's when health people started declining. And it's only with modern sanitation and medicine that we basically got back up to and now slightly exceeding the health conditions of the past. But as we've done that, we've we get lots of diseases, which we call mismatched diseases, because our bodies aren't really well adapted for some of the diets and activities and stresses that we live today. So hunter-gatherers, for example, as far as we can tell, don't get heart disease, which is the #1 killer of people in the world today. They don't, they're not susceptible to a lot of the infectious, contagious diseases that we get today, because they don't live in large population densities. They don't get diseases like cholera and things like that. They don't get, and diabetes and cancers. All of them are less common, less frequent, and so we have a lot to learn. We don't necessarily have to go back to living that kind of lifestyle. We have a lot to learn about health and disease and biology from studying non-Western, non-farming populations.
So what was interesting from what you said is you did say 7 decades, right? So that's 70 years.
That's correct.
The current average lifespan in America is 78.9 years.
That's
so not
correct, yeah.
8 decades, but just underneath. So essentially we've gained 9 years.
9 years, but so there's two, there's two, when we think about disease, there's two important variables. There's mortality when you die, but also morbidity, which is illness.
Yeah.
And what we have now is what we call an extension of morbidity. So as people are living longer, they're actually living more of their lives, essentially, especially towards the end of their life, in a state of illness, right? People have heart disease, they have osteoporosis, they have arthritis, they have, the list of diseases is very, very long. These are chronic disabling diseases. And what's fascinating is that in many sort of non-Western, non-industrial populations, those kinds of morbidities are much, much less. We have what's called a compression of morbidity in those populations. And so people basically used to live relatively healthy lives up until they got sick and died, but they got sick and died very quickly. But now we spread out that process over a very long period of time, and aren't actually living that much longer. And so that's the bad news. The good news is that a lot of those diseases, those chronic illnesses, are preventable. Heart disease is mostly preventable. Diabetes is mostly preventable. The list goes on. And so what we can, and medicine is mostly designed to treat people once they get sick, but evolution helps us prevent those diseases in the first place.
So that's interesting to know, how do we take some of those preventive measures early on in life. So I have some more questions for you, Professor. Many people believe that humans have stopped evolving. So do you know why this belief still persists, and what modern evidence is there to show that humans are still, the evolution process goes on?
Well, it kind of mystifies me where this idea comes from. I think it comes from a belief that culture is so powerful now that culture is sort of acts as a buffer to prevent evolution from occurring. But the definition of evolution is just change over time. And there's different kinds of evolution. And the one that we often think about is natural selection, where gene frequencies change over time. But it's quite clear that even if you think about natural selection, it hasn't ended. It's just hard to observe. But the ingredients of natural selection are variation, heritability, and differential reproductive success. That some people have more children than other children, and all those ingredients are still there. All those, so natural selection is still occurring. It's just that we don't see it very easily in our lives. But people who've been measuring it, for example, in Framingham, Massachusetts, which is a town right outside of Boston, which is where the Framingham Heart Study is based, and where we get our cholesterol recommendations and various other important medical studies have come from Framingham. We've now been studying people in Framingham for 3 generations. We have genetic data, we have physiological data, we have everything about these people, and it's quite clear that selection is still operating in Framingham. So we actually know, for example, that women who are shorter and slightly plumper had actually been selected in Framingham. And there's also data from Finland and other places where we're studying evolution. So no, evolution hasn't changed, but we're also getting new kinds of evolution. And the most important kind is cultural evolution, right? And our bodies are changing because of the diets and physical activity and stresses, etc. And that's a kind of change too that's important. And also, of course, powerful and rapid and fast. I mean, Diabetes, for example, is the fastest growing disease in the world. It's now it's, very, very major disease in India, for
It
example.
is. I was going to tell you, we are the diabetes capital of the world.
I know, yeah. And so
And we come from the
that's
state where it's the highest in Bengal, I think.
yes, that's right. And that's a kind of evolution. It's not a biological evolution. So it's not like genes for diabetes have swept through the population of India. It's those genes were there already, but cultural change, cultural evolution has changed people's environments, and people are vulnerable to the disease. And now that disease is occurring very rapidly. And then of course we have a cultural response to that disease. And so that's a form of evolution too. It's not natural selection, but it's also evolution. It's change over time.
So as for instance, I mean, if I was going to, speak about Bengal even briefly, I mean, the kind of diet that nowadays people eat where there's so many sugars. My grandfather lived to be 104, and the only problem he had at the end is he couldn't hear. That was the only problem. And then he just died. But here was a man who, they had a 5 or 6 course meal, Dan. And small quantities, always had yogurt and small quantities of everything. Today we sit and, our food habits have changed drastically from what he ate. And here we are, boom, all have diabetes now.
Yeah, processed foods are pernicious. They cause incredible problems. The other, of course, big shift is physical activity. So now we have cars and buses and chairs with seat backs, and I mean, everything has changed. We sit and look into computers all day long, or TV, and that's also had enormous effects on health and disease. So the combination of diet and exercise, as well as also psychosocial stress from the world around us, are all wreaking havoc with our bodies.
And the next question is, you spent many years studying how humans have evolved to be uniquely adapted to relatively high degrees of exercise. So can you tell us how this is the case? And you've also described the exercise dilemma, which I actually found very interesting, because I have this exercise dilemma. So, and how did the hunter-gatherer society, when you studied them, what insights are provided through that?
Well, it's important to recognize that there's a difference between physical activity and exercise. So physical activity is just moving, right? Doing stuff. When you go out and dig in your garden, that's physical activity. When you walk to get a bus or walk to a store, that's physical activity. Exercise is voluntary physical activity for the sake of health and fitness. And for millions of years, our ancestors, just like other animals, had to be physically active in order to survive. That's how they got their food. And they also were physically active when they were young in order to play, to develop their bodies. But people were physically active for 2 reasons: when it was necessary or when it was fun. And otherwise, they sensibly rested, because when you're just able to get just enough food to survive, spending extra energy, running around is a silly thing, right? So nobody in the old days went for a 5-mile, run in the morning just for the sake of a 5-mile run for their health. That's crazy. That's a modern thing. But we do that today because now I don't, have to do anything to get my food. My food comes in a box. I have to just press a button and I get dinner. I mean, it's amazing. I can spend my entire day and never have to get my heart rate up. And so now, but the problem is that our bodies never evolved to function properly, especially to age properly and to develop appropriate capacities without some degree of physical activity. So hunter-gatherers, it turns out, and our ancestors didn't have to work crazy hard. We have data that shows that the average hunter-gatherer engages in about 135 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous activity. So that's 2 hours and a quarter.
Okay.
And that's not, really a lot of huge amount of work. It's just a moderate amount of work. And otherwise, they basically sit around in camp and do modest things and do very light activities, right? Today, public health officials are begging people to get 150 minutes a week of exercise. That's 21 minutes a day.
Yeah.
And most people don't even get that. But we're begging people to do that. That's considered the minimum amount of physical activity. Just 21 minutes a day of walking.
That's 10%, less than 10% of the 135.
That's correct. Yes, exactly right. So, and it turns out that if you just get 150 minutes a week of moderate exercise, so that's just basically like a brisk walk, for example, you can lower your relative rate of dying, so the rate at which you age and die, by about 50%. It's huge. And that's based on millions of that data set is based on millions of people. It's not a number I just pulled out of my hat. That's a very, very, very well established figure. So it doesn't take a huge amount of exercise to kind of restore what used to be sort of normal and is sort of effectively necessary for the human body. But just a moderate amount goes a huge way. But our ancestors, you know, they walked 5 to 9 miles a day. They climbed trees occasionally to get food. They dug to get things out of the ground. Sometimes they ran long distances. That's what I'm most famous for my research on running. But for the most part, they also rested. And it's that combination of rest and activity that's normal. And now we've just removed the activity. And all we do is rest all day long. And the result is
with enormous amounts of food, of course, thrown in.
And yes, and you also add more food, especially processed food, which is rich in sugar and fat.
And I must tell you, Dan, I have actually seen some of your videos where you're running in the snow barefoot. And I was really impressed with that.
Oh, well, you know, I enjoy barefoot running, but I don't normally run barefoot in the winter. That was because they asked me to. So
yeah, okay.
I'm not a crazy person. I wear shoes most of the time.
Yeah.
But that was for when we published this paper on barefoot running, the nature folks came, and it was in the winter, so they asked me to run barefoot outside. But no, I don't normally run barefoot in the winter.
And you also, in that particular interview, I think you have the treadmill there, and you actually show how the foot lands, right?
That's
when
correct.
We wear these very fancy shoes with a lot of padding, and we land all wrong. Yeah,
so I think running, like a lot of activities, is a skill. And you know, there's good ways to run and bad ways to run, and one of the consequences of wearing very cushioned, comfortable shoes is that it doesn't really matter how you run anymore. And I think people don't learn how to run properly. And so I think I'm not saying that everybody should run barefoot. That's not necessary, but we can learn from studying barefoot running how our bodies were essentially meant to run, and learn better running form. And I think that's the importance of barefoot running. You learn to run much more lightly and more gently, so you don't crash into the ground, and use your shoe to kind of cushion you.
Yeah, because, you know, as you age, osteoporosis is there, right? And then you have issues with your knees, for instance, ankles. So how you land on your feet is very important, whether it's fast walking or even running.
That's correct. And shoes also, we've just published a paper in Nature last year showing how shoes affect how we walk too. So shoes remove sensory information that your body normally uses to modulate how you walk. So people walk differently when they're barefoot or wearing very thin-soled shoes versus when they're wearing very cushioned shoes. And we think that may be contributing to rates of arthritis, which have doubled since World War II.
Yeah.
So again, we think that an evolutionary perspective can help us use our bodies better, especially as we age.
Okay. You know, you also describe how inadequate exercise accelerates aging. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So aging is a result of many processes, right? There are too many to list here, and none of them are very pleasant to discuss. But you know, we produce what we call reactive oxygen species. So these are molecules that are reactive. They cause, you know, when fruits or vegetables turn brown, that's oxidation. Well, our bodies produce molecules that cause oxidation too. We have, you know, enzymes break down, mutations and proteins break down, mutations accrue in our DNA, our chromosomes shorten. There are all kinds of processes that occur that cause us to age. And what we know is that physical activity is a stress, right? If I go for a 5-mile run right now, I'll stress my body and actually produce some of those reactive oxygen species, and I'll heat up my body and cause some protein damage. But what happens is that my body responds to those stresses and produces repair and maintenance mechanisms. So when I exercise, I produce antioxidants. I produce enzymes that repair proteins. I replace the mitochondria that get damaged. Everything that's stressful about exercise gets repaired and replaced and fixed. But it turns out those damaging processes just occur all the time at a low level, but we don't turn on those repair and maintenance processes when we're just sitting around. so because they're expensive, right? So we turn them on when we need them. And
Mhm.
since nobody ever was physically inactive in the past, we never evolved to turn them on in the absence of physical activity. So what we get is that if we as we age and we don't stay physically active, we don't repair and maintain our bodies as effectively as if we were, exercising occasionally. And the result is that we age faster. And the data are clear. I mean, in almost every tissue that you look at in the body, exercise slows the rate at which that tissue ages. The brain, perhaps the most important of them all. Exercise is really the only way to prevent Alzheimer's disease, actually, and various kinds of dementia. It's good for your muscles. It's good for your bones. It's good for your digestive system. The list is really long. And so and a lot of these diseases, of course, don't occur until we're in our 50s or 60s or 70s. And so that's why it's important, not only exercise when you're young, but to continue to exercise as you age, because we didn't evolve to retire and just kind of put our legs up and do nothing. We evolved to live long lives. We evolved to be grandparents, as we were talking earlier, but not to be inactive. We evolved to be grandparents in order to be active, so we could help our children and our grandchildren. And so it's almost like a chicken and an egg question. Did we evolve to live long in order to be active, or do we evolve to be active in order to live long? It's actually the same thing. But we didn't evolve to live long in order just to do nothing.
And thank you, Dan, for explaining that so beautifully, because now I understand very simply put the process of oxidation, which happens like we see on a banana or an apple that's cut and left lying around, is what happens inside our body. And with exercise and with the stress hormones that are induced at that point of time, the reverse mechanism starts happening. Very simply put, would you say it's correct?
That's exactly correct. So for example, there's so many mechanisms, but for example, we have we always call our autonomic nervous system. That's the part of your nervous system that you don't control, right? And there's one that kind of is called the flight and flight response. That's the sympathetic nervous system that makes you stressed, right? Well, it doesn't make you stressed. It gets turned on when we're stressed. So if you're very worried about COVID, or you're worried about, the president, or you're worried about exercise, whatever, you get stressed, right? And then you produce hormones like cortisol, or epinephrine, which turn up your heart, or I think you call it adrenaline in India, right?
Yes.
Gets your heart rate up, and it activates your body, right? And you do that too when you exercise. But when you exercise, you then turn off those mechanisms. You actually then depress cortisol levels. You depress the adrenaline levels. You activate what's called the rest and digest system, and that lowers your body's hormonal stress response and makes you calmer. Everybody knows that after they exercise, they feel kind of relaxed and calm. The problem is that we don't turn those mechanisms off without exercising as effectively. And so if you want to turn off all those stress responses, you need to generate some stress in the first place. We call that good stress, or eustress. And it's essential to sort of normal aging and normal function.
And though many people know that exercise is important for physical fitness and maintaining body weight, you and others have also discussed how exercise affects the immune system and mental health. I think we talked a little bit about the immune system, mental health. Can you tell us a little more about the slightly less known factors, particularly for dementia? And of course, Alzheimer's is maybe 60% of the dementia patients are actually Alzheimer patients.
Yeah, it turns out that exercise is incredibly important for mental health, because it turns on a whole series of mechanisms in the body that maintain and affect mood, as well as the function of the nervous system. So exercise produces dopamine and serotonin, which are important in terms of mental health and depression and anxiety. But also exercise produces proteins called brain-derived neurotropic factors, BDNFs. If you go for a run, for example, after listening to this, or a walk, or whatever it is you like to do, or swim or something, your body will produce BDNFs. BDNFs then actually act on neurons in the brain, and actually help maintain and actually grow neurons in the brain. And there are various other proteins as well that have been discovered recently. So physical activity turns out to be by far the most important way to protect against dementia and Alzheimer's. It has major effects in improving mood, improving attention. You learn more, you're smarter, you remember more, you're happier, you're less depressed. I mean, and we all sort of know this, right? Everybody knows that exercise makes us feel good. But it's not just by accident. I think it's an involved system. And I think part of that has to, again, to do with stress, but also part of it has to do with the fact that when we used to exercise, we were out there using our environments, and you need to, when is it that you really need to be really good at spatial memory and remembering things? Is when you're out, not in camp, but when you're outside and trying to remember where you're in the landscape and trying to hunt an animal or figure out what plants to dig up. So it's not a coincidence. It actually makes evolutionary sense that physical activity improves memory and mood and cognition and brain function.
Yeah, and as actually our populations age, the rate of people developing Alzheimer's dementia is just so incredibly high. I know that the figure in India today is around 5 million at least. It's somewhere between 4.5 and 5 million people living with dementia, and most of them live at home. Only about 2, 3, 4,000 have institutional care. So maybe under 5,000 institutional care and the rest living at home. So yeah, so the need for exercise, if you can get this out, that how important it is just to staying well. And
nothing else has been shown to really prevent Alzheimer's apart from exercise. Nothing.
Really? Oh, this bit I didn't know. Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. What is the grandmother hypothesis and human longevity, and why is it considered so unique or unique to humans?
So the grandmother hypothesis is not my hypothesis, but this is the idea that humans, humans, most animals die basically when they stop reproducing. Because natural selection doesn't really care about you anymore. If you're not producing offspring, natural selection doesn't really care that you're alive or not. You see this, what we call the selective shadow. You cease to be important from a selective perspective. But humans are unique, one of the few species that typically lives beyond our reproductive age. And the reason for that is that grandparents still help their reproductive success. They do that by sharing knowledge and wisdom and information, but they also do it by working. So if we look in hunter-gatherer societies or even in farming societies, grandparents, again, they don't go to, on vacation and retire. They still work and they gather food and they collect food or they dig food or whatever it is that they do, and they provide food to their children and their grandchildren. They help take care of babies. They work. So we evolved to live to be grandparents in order to improve our reproductive success, but that involved physical activity. So I call this the active grandparent hypothesis. So I think it's not just that we evolved to be grandparents to help our offspring. Yeah. We also evolved to be active grandparents. And that's why physical activity during aging is so important. It's the two are, it's like a chicken and egg question. The two are inseparable. And aging and physical activity. I'm sorry?
You mentioned when you said even hunter-gatherers, if they got through the child mortality stage, could have lived to be about 70 years old. So they would then have been supporting the younger childbearing women.
And oh yes, absolutely. So for example, we have data on how much, so in some of the populations in Africa where we come from, we have data on how much time women spend digging up tubers, roots, vegetables in the ground, right? Turns out that mothers don't spend as much time as grandmothers digging up food. Why? Because mothers have to take care of their babies, right? So grandma can spend more time digging up food, which is physical activity. It's labor. It's hard work. I mean, I've watched these Hadza ladies, dig up tubers. It's, it's really, it's a reasonable amount of effort. But we have data to show that they actually spend more time digging than mothers because they're producing a surplus, which they're giving to their daughters and their granddaughters. They also, they walk just as much. We have data on how much they walk. They don't, when you're an older woman, you don't stop going out every day to get food. You actually walk just as much as everybody else. And because they're still active, they stay fit. So their walking speed doesn't go down. Their grip strength stays strong. They stay healthy and fit because they're still using their bodies. And we see this in our culture too. Some of your listeners may know about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, our Supreme Court Justice. Ruth Justice Ginsburg, who's almost 90, she goes and works out in the gym every day. She's a little old lady, but she stays fit and strong. And actually, they just published a book on her workout routine. But she's able to. It just shows that when you're older, your body doesn't stop working and your muscles don't stop growing. These processes, these mechanisms still work as you get older.
And on the other side, for Justice Baden Ginsburg, she's apparently been, going through her legal work and giving judgments while in hospital. I think she's a cancer patient or something. So she was hospitalized and she was actually, working there. So that means her brain is also active through
that. She's sharp as a tack. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's quite incredible. And she's 89 or something, right?
Something like that. Yeah, yeah.
And one last question for you, Dan, and I know we need to let you go. Exercising can, of course, be stressful on the skeletal system, and elderly individuals often suffer from poor bone health, osteoporosis, etc. So can you tell us what is the relationship again between exercise and aging and bone-based conditions such as osteoporosis? How can we prevent osteoporosis or the effects of osteoporosis as we age?
Well, I mean, that's a complicated question, but osteoporosis is a disease that accrues very slowly over a lifetime. And you grow your skeleton when you're young, and by the age of about 30, you stop adding bone. And then from the age of 30 on, you start losing bone. And women lose bone faster than men, especially after menopause, as levels of estrogen decline, and estrogen sort of helps protect the skeleton. So there's several ways in which physical activity are important in preventing osteoporosis. So one of them is that when you're young, you actually put on more bone mass if you're physically active. So if you develop a healthier skeleton when you're young, that skeleton there's more of it, so that as you get older and you lose bone, there's still enough so that you don't fall below that line where you get frail and your bones can break. The other thing is that when you stay physically active as you're older, you lose bone at a slower rate. Physical activity slows the rate of bone loss. And physical activity also strengthens your muscles. Think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg doing her workouts, right? She keeps her muscles strong, and muscles are important for bone health too. So that's important because muscles not only protect bones from breaking, but also add forces to bones. And it turns out physical activity is also important for our joints. It actually helps keep our joints functioning. So physical activity, again, has important repair and mechanisms and maintenance mechanisms for our entire musculoskeletal system that help keep it healthy. That said, as you get older, you also have to be careful, as everybody knows, and you don't want to overdo it. So as we get older, we need to be more attentive to what's enough but not too much, right? You don't want to, because a broken bone when you're 20 is not such a big deal, but a broken bone when you're 80 is very serious. So as we get older, we have to be more careful about how we exercise. Doesn't mean that exercise is less important. It just means that you don't want to overdo it in terms of stress. So it's important to follow good advice and good information about doing it carefully and hopefully.
It becomes very necessary that we start listening to ourselves and listening to our bodies, because very often if we are tuned in, we will get those signals back.
Oh yes, if something hurts, you probably shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah.
Pain is an adaptation. Pain is an adaptation that tells us that you shouldn't be doing it. But we have these no pain, no gain sort of phrases that, okay, if you want to be like Arnold Schwarzenegger or something, some bodybuilder, okay, fine. But for most of us, that's not a really very good idea.
And many of us don't aspire to that either, so it's okay.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness.
Oh, thank you, Dan, for being with us. And it's been such an informative talk, Thank you so much for, bringing other aspects, just highlighting how we've evolved and why exercise is necessary and the process in, exercise and aging and healthy aging. So thanks very much for being with us today at Unmukt.
My pleasure. Thank you.